The Clearwater County Courthouse stood like a fortress of marble and oak, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding within its walls. I clutched the worn leather folder against my chest as I approached the imposing double doors, each step a battle against my arthritic knees and the weight of 78 years. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from exertion, but from the knowledge of what awaited me inside. "Mrs. Patterson, wait!" My neighbor Sophia hurried toward me, her silver hair catching the morning light. "Let me walk in with you." I smiled gratefully but shook my head. "This is something I need to face alone, dear." The security guard nodded respectfully as I passed through the metal detector. The folder, the one I'd kept hidden for decades, passed through without incident, just as its secrets had remained dormant all these years. Courtroom 3 was already buzzing with whispers when I entered. My son Christopher sat at the plaintiff's table, his shoulders hunched beneath his expensive suit. Beside him, my daughter-in-law Kimberly looked radiant in cream-colored linen, her honey-blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon. The shark-like confidence in her smile made my stomach clench. As I moved toward the defendant's table, Kimberly leaned toward her lawyer, a young man with slicked-back hair and a crimson tie, and whispered just loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "She's nothing but an old woman. This will be over in minutes." A ripple of barely concealed laughter flowed through the observers. Christopher stared down at his hands, refusing to meet my eyes. The shame of his betrayal burned in my chest, but I straightened my spine, refusing to bow. My court-appointed attorney, Ms. Rivera, greeted me with a firm handshake. "Are you ready, Mrs. Patterson?" "Helen," I corrected gently. "And yes, as ready as I'll ever be." The bailiff's voice boomed across the room. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Edward Sinclair." The judge entered, his black robes flowing behind him like a shadow. His face was weathered but dignified, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they landed on. He settled into his chair with practiced efficiency, adjusted his glasses, and began reviewing the documents before him. Case number 27593, Ross versus Patterson, regarding competency and property rights. His voice was deep and authoritative. "I've reviewed the preliminary," and then it happened. Judge Sinclair's eyes lifted from the papers and landed squarely on me. The words died on his lips. His composure, legendary in Clearwater County, cracked visibly. Those piercing eyes widened with disbelief, and the color drained from his face as though he'd seen a ghost. "Is that really her?" he asked, barely above a whisper. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Lawyers stopped shuffling papers. The court reporter's fingers froze above her machine. Even Kimberly's smirk faltered, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawing together in confusion. I met the judge's gaze steadily, my hands no longer trembling as they rested on my folder. "Yes, Your Honor," I replied softly. "It's been a long time." Judge Sinclair cleared his throat, struggling to regain his professional demeanor. This court will take a 15-minute recess. Counsel, approach the bench immediately." As the gavel struck, chaos erupted. Kimberly grabbed her lawyer's arm, her face twisted with panic. Christopher finally looked up, his expression a mix of confusion and dread. Whispers swirled around me like autumn leaves caught in a whirlwind. Ms. Rivera leaned toward me, bewilderment etched across her features. "Mrs. Patterson, Helen, what just happened? Do you know Judge Sinclair?" I watched as the judge disappeared through the door behind the bench, his usual measured stride replaced by barely contained urgency. "Yes," I answered, my voice calm despite the storm brewing inside me. Though he wouldn't have known it until today, Judge Sinclair owes his career to me, and that's only the beginning of what this courtroom is about to learn. Ms. Rivera's eyes fell to the folder I still clutched. "Is that what I think it is?" "It's everything," I said simply. "Everything they tried to erase." My mind drifted back through the decades, to the humble house in Clearwater, where I'd raised Christopher alone after my husband Richard's sudden death. Our endless nights of sewing other people's clothes to pay for my son's education. The early mornings baking pies for local diners. The weekends cleaning offices, including the small law practice where a young Edward Sinclair had once worked as a clerk, drowning in debt and nearly giving up on his dream. I remembered the day I'd found him sobbing in the empty office, eviction notice in hand, ready to abandon law school. I remembered the 3 months of free pies I'd delivered to his landlord in exchange for leniency. I remembered the textbooks I'd scoured yard sales to find for him. I remembered his graduation day, watching from the back row, invisible to everyone, including him. I looked up to see Kimberly stalking toward me, her face a mask of cold fury. "What kind of stunt are you pulling?" she hissed. leaning over the barrier. Whatever lies you fed the judge won't work. You're just a confused old woman who can't take care of herself anymore. Before I could respond, Christopher appeared at her side, placing a restraining hand on her arm. Kim, not here, he muttered, his eyes darting nervously around the courtroom. Your father would be ashamed, I said quietly, looking directly at my son. Not of what you're doing to me, but of what you're doing to yourself. Christopher flinched as if I'd slapped him. For a brief moment, I glimpsed the sweet boy I'd raised, the child who'd brought me wildflowers from the yard, who'd drawn crayon pictures of the two of us holding hands beneath a smiling sun. Then the mask slipped back into place, hardened by years of Kimberly's influence. We're doing this for your own good, Mom, he said mechanically. You can't live alone anymore. I looked from him to the palatial house keys dangling from Kimberly's designer purse, the house they claimed I couldn't maintain, the house they'd already mentally moved into. We'll see about that, I replied, opening the folder for the first time in 30 years. Inside lay the truth that would change everything. The truth about sacrifice, about dignity, and about the power that comes from a lifetime of quiet strength. The courtroom doors swung open, and Judge Sinclair returned, his face set with newfound purpose. Court is back in session, the bailiff announced. As everyone settled back into their places, I felt a strange calm wash over me. For decades, I had carried the burden of invisibility. I had been the woman who cleaned their offices after hours, who hemmed their pants, who baked their celebration cakes. I had been Christopher's financial and emotional support, never asking for recognition. And when Kimberly entered our lives, I had stepped aside, becoming the backdrop to their grand plans. But today, in this moment, I would finally be seen. Judge Sinclair adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. The courtroom remained unusually silent, the typical shuffling and whispers replaced by a tense anticipation that seemed to electrify the air. Before we proceed, he began, his voice carefully controlled, I wish to address a matter of potential conflict of interest. Kimberly's lawyer immediately rose to his feet. Your Honor, if there's any prior relationship or with the defendant, there is no prior personal relationship, Counselor, Judge Sinclair interrupted. However, in the interest of full transparency, I feel compelled to disclose that Mrs. Patterson once extended significant help to me during my early law career, though I was unaware of her identity until today. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Christopher shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Kimberly's perfectly manicured nails drummed impatiently against the table. That said, the judge continued, I believe I can adjudicate this case impartially. However, if either party wishes to request a different judge, I will grant such motion without prejudice. Kimberly leaned forward eagerly, but her lawyer placed a cautioning hand on her arm after a quick assessment of the courtroom. The crowd's sympathy had visibly shifted toward me, and requesting a new judge might appear as though they had something to hide. We have no objection, Your Honor, the lawyer stated, though Kimberly's tightened jaw suggested otherwise. Ms. Rivera glanced at me questioningly. I nodded slightly. The defense has no objection, Your Honor, she confirmed. Very well. Judge Sinclair straightened the papers before him. For the record, this case concerns a petition filed by Christopher and Kimberly Ross to declare Helen Patterson mentally incompetent to manage her own affairs and property, citing alleged cognitive decline and inability to maintain her residence. Mrs. Patterson contests these claims. He looked directly at Christopher and Kimberly's lawyer. You may proceed. With your case, Counselor. The lawyer, Mr. Hargrove, according to the placard on his table, rose with the confidence of someone who believed victory was already assured. He buttoned his expensive jacket with a practiced motion and approached the bench. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about protection, not control, he began smoothly. Christopher Ross is deeply concerned about his mother's well-being. Over the past year, Mrs. Patterson has demonstrated increasing forgetfulness, poor judgment, and an inability to maintain her property. Hargrove gestured toward a stack of documents on his table. We have reports from Dr. Leonard Collins, who assessed Mrs. Patterson and found significant cognitive concerns consistent with early-stage dementia. We have photographs documenting the deteriorating condition of her home. We have utility bills showing late payments. I watched as he painted a picture of me as a doddering old woman, too feeble to change a light bulb or remember to lock my doors at night. Each word was a carefully placed brushstroke, creating an image of someone I didn't recognize. Most concerningly, Hargrove continued, Mrs. Patterson was recently found wandering in her nightgown at 2 a.m., disoriented and unable to recall her address. This outright lie made me grip the edge of the table. I had never wandered anywhere, except perhaps through my garden at sunrise, fully dressed and perfectly aware of my surroundings. Christopher and his wife simply want what's best for Mrs. Patterson, Hargrove concluded with practiced sincerity. They're prepared to relocate her to Sunny Pines Assisted Living, where she'll receive proper care, while ensuring her home is maintained until such time as more permanent arrangements become necessary. Translation: until they could sell it out from under me and pocket the proceeds. When Ms. Rivera's turn came, she approached the situation methodically, challenging the credentials of Dr. Collins, who coincidentally played golf with Christopher every Sunday, and presenting affidavits from my neighbors testifying to my lucidity and self-sufficiency. Mrs. Patterson regularly volunteers at the community library, tends an award-winning garden, and manages her household with complete independence, Ms. Rivera stated. This petition isn't about protection, it's about property. The morning proceeded with testimony from Christopher, who recounted cherry-picked incidents where I'd forgotten minor details or misplaced items. Ordinary moments experienced by people of any age, magnified and twisted into evidence of decline. Mom left the stove on once, he testified, carefully avoiding my gaze. She could have burned the house down. What he didn't mention was that I'd been interrupted by his phone call that day. A call demanding I sign over my late husband's vintage car collection to him because Dad would have wanted it. When it was Kimberly's turn to testify, she arranged her features into a mask of concern so transparent I almost admired her audacity. Helen often seems confused about who I am, she claimed, dabbing at non-existent tears. Sometimes she calls me by other names. And the house? It's simply too much for someone her age to maintain. Such a beautiful property deserves proper care. By noon, I felt wrung out by the parade of distortions and half-truths. Judge Sinclair called for a lunch recess, and as the courtroom began to empty, Sophia slipped into the seat beside me. "They're vultures," she whispered fiercely. "Every person in this courtroom can see through their act." I squeezed her hand gratefully. "It's not over yet." "Helen," Ms. Rivera said quietly, "they've presented a compelling narrative about your mental state. We need to counter it decisively." I nodded, my fingers tracing the edges of the folder I still hadn't opened. "When it's my turn to testify, I'll show you exactly who I am." During the recess, I sat alone in a quiet corner of the courthouse hallway, gathering my strength. The morning's proceedings had confirmed what I'd long suspected. This wasn't about my well-being, but about my 4-bedroom craftsman home on 2 acres of prime Clearwater real estate, the home where Richard and I had planned to grow old together, where I'd raised our son alone after pneumonia took my husband far too soon. I thought about the sacrifices that had gone into keeping that house, the endless nights sewing custom dresses, the weekends spent baking wedding cakes, the meticulous budgeting that allowed me to pay off our mortgage a decade early while still putting Christopher through college. I thought about how Kimberly had entered our lives like a hurricane, charming and destructive, how she'd gradually turned my son against me, with whispers and manipulations, how the invitations to Sunday dinners had dwindled, then stopped, how Christopher's calls became increasingly perfunctory, always ending with subtle questions about my will or estate planning. When court resumed, Dr. Collins took the stand, his silver hair and confident demeanor lending an air of authority to his fabrications. He testified that I showed classic signs of cognitive impairment based on a single 30-minute evaluation in his office, an evaluation I now realized had been a sham from the beginning. As he described my supposed inability to recall simple facts or perform basic tasks, I felt a strange detachment, as though he were describing a character in a poorly written play. This wasn't me. This had never been me. When Ms. Rivera finally called me to the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. I moved slowly but steadily to the witness box, my head held high despite the ache in my knees. As I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, I felt the weight of the moment. Not just for me, but for every older person who had ever been dismissed, patronized, or pushed aside. "Mrs. Patterson," Ms. Rivera began gently, "how would you describe your current mental and physical condition?" I looked directly at the jury, then at my son and his wife, and finally at Judge Sinclair. "I am a 78-year-old woman with arthritis in my knees and reading glasses in my purse," I stated clearly. "I forget where I put my car keys sometimes, just like I did in my 30s. I occasionally need help changing light bulbs in high ceilings, just like I did in my 40s. But my mind is as clear as it has ever been, and my home is as well maintained as my fixed income allows. I paused, meeting Christopher's eyes for the first time that day. And I am still perfectly capable of recognizing when I'm being lied about by the people who should love me most. I remained composed on the witness stand as Kimberly's lawyer approached for cross-examination. Mr. Hargrove's smile never reached his eyes as he adjusted his crimson tie. "Mrs. Patterson," he began, emphasizing my title with subtle condescension, "you claim your mental faculties are intact. Yet Dr. Collins, a respected neurologist with 30 years of experience, has testified otherwise. How do you account for this discrepancy?" "Perhaps," I replied evenly, "because Dr. Collins spent more time discussing golf with my son than evaluating my cognitive function during our brief meeting." A few chuckles rippled through the gallery. Hargrove's smile tightened. "Mrs. Patterson, isn't it true that you were found wandering your neighborhood in your nightclothes at 2 a.m. just 3 weeks ago?" "No, it is not true." My voice remained steady despite my rising indignation. "I have never wandered anywhere in my nightclothes." "So you're claiming my clients fabricated this incident?" His eyebrows rose dramatically as though I'd just confirmed my own delusion. "I'm stating that it never happened," I replied. "And if you check with the Clearwater Police Department, you'll find no record of such an incident." Hargrove faltered momentarily before switching tactics. "Let's discuss your home maintenance, then. Your son has provided photographs showing significant neglect, gutters overflowing, paint peeling, a broken porch step that presents a serious hazard. Those photographs," I said carefully, "were taken the week after Christopher canceled the maintenance service he had supposedly arranged for me, without informing me. The service his father had paid for in advance before his death with instructions that it continue through my lifetime." Ms. Rivera rose. "Your Honor, we have documentation from Clearwater Home Services confirming Mrs. Patterson's statement. The 20-year maintenance contract was indeed canceled by Mr. Ross approximately 6 months ago." Judge Sinclair accepted the document, reviewing it with narrowed eyes before nodding for Hargrove to continue. The lawyer's confidence visibly dimmed. "Mrs. Patterson," he pressed on, "regardless of the maintenance issue, do you truly believe you can manage that large property by yourself at your age?" "I've managed it alone since my husband died 27 years ago," I answered. "I raised my son there by myself, working 3 jobs to keep our home while putting food on the table, and sending him to college. Age hasn't diminished my ability to care for the place I love, only made me more efficient at it." Hargrove glanced at his clients, clearly receiving some silent signal from Kimberly, whose face had hardened into marble. "Let's move to financial competence," he said, producing a folder with a flourish. "We have evidence of several overdue utility bills and a property tax payment that was nearly missed last quarter. Wouldn't you agree these indicate diminishing capacity to manage your finances?" This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I looked directly at Christopher, whose eyes finally met mine before quickly darting away. "Those bills," I said quietly, "became overdue when Christopher convinced me to add him to my checking account for emergencies, then transferred nearly $8,000 to his personal account without my knowledge. The money I'd carefully saved for property taxes and utilities." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Judge Sinclair leaned forward, his expression darkening. "That's a serious allegation, Mrs. Patterson," he said. "Do you have evidence to support it?" "Yes, Your Honor." Ms. Rivera approached with bank statements I'd provided earlier. These documents clearly show the unauthorized transfer, dated February 12th of this year. As the judge examined the paperwork, I watched my son's face crumple with shame. Beside him, Kimberly whispered furiously in his ear, her fingernails digging into his sleeve. "Mr. Hargrove," the judge said finally, "in light of this information, does your client wish to continue with this line of questioning?" The lawyer conferred briefly with Christopher and Kimberly, their whispered exchange growing increasingly heated. "No further questions at this time, Your Honor," he conceded reluctantly. As I stepped down from the witness stand, my legs trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the emotional toll of publicly exposing my son's betrayal. I never wanted to humiliate Christopher. I only wanted him to remember the values I'd worked so hard to instill in him. The afternoon proceeded with testimony from my neighbors, the community librarian where I volunteered twice weekly, and even my longtime physician, Dr. Marissa Chen, who emphatically refuted Dr. Collins's assessment of my cognitive state. "I've been Helen's doctor for 15 years, Dr. Chen testified firmly. "She undergoes regular cognitive screenings as part of her annual physical, and all results have been well within normal parameters for her age. In fact, her recall and processing abilities routinely test above average for her demographic. By late afternoon, Kimberly's confidence had visibly eroded, her perfect posture slouching slightly as each witness further undermined their case. Christopher looked increasingly uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with everyone, including his wife. Judge Sinclair called for a brief recess before closing arguments. As the courtroom emptied, Ms. Rivera turned to me with cautious optimism. "We've made significant progress," she said. "Their case is falling apart." I nodded, but my heart remained heavy. "This isn't a victory I wanted." "Helen," she said gently, "sometimes justice requires difficult truths to be spoken." During the recess, I remained seated at our table, watching as Christopher paced the hallway outside, engaged in what appeared to be a tense phone conversation. Kimberly sat alone at their table, furiously texting on her phone. The distance between them spoke volumes. When court resumed, Mr. Hargrove delivered a closing argument that sounded hollow even to my ears, a rehearsed speech about family concerns and preemptive care that couldn't mask the opportunism beneath. Ms. Rivera's closing was simple but powerful. "This case isn't about cognitive decline or home maintenance," she stated. "It's about a son and daughter-in-law attempting to seize valuable property from a capable, independent woman whose only crime is having outlived their patience. Mrs. Patterson doesn't need protection from herself. She needs protection from those who claim to have her best interests at heart while actively undermining her autonomy." As the arguments concluded, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Whatever happened next, I had stood my ground with dignity. I had spoken my truth. Judge Sinclair removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose before addressing the courtroom. "This case presents troubling questions about elder care versus elder exploitation," he began. "I've heard testimony suggesting both cognitive concerns and evidence of financial manipulation. Before rendering a decision, I believe it would benefit the court to examine additional evidence regarding Mrs. Patterson's competence and the actual motivations behind this petition." He looked directly at me. "Mrs. Patterson, your attorney indicated you may have relevant documentation you wish to present to this court." This was the moment I'd both dreaded and prepared for. I nodded, my fingers tightening around the worn leather folder I'd guarded for nearly 30 years. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady. Despite the hammering of my heart, "I do." The courtroom fell silent as Ms. Rivera approached the bench with the leather folder. Judge Sinclair examined it carefully before instructing her to present its contents. "Your Honor," Ms. Rivera began, "what we are about to present reveals not only Mrs. Patterson's complete financial competence, but also establishes a pattern of deliberate manipulation by the plaintiffs." She opened the folder and removed several documents bound with a faded blue ribbon. "First, we have the deed to Mrs. Patterson's home, paid in full 20 years ago through her sole earnings after her husband's death." She placed the deed on the evidence table before continuing. "Next, we have bank statements documenting the systematic way Mrs. Patterson funded her sons' education, working as a seamstress, baker, and office cleaner, often 17 hours a day." Christopher shifted uncomfortably as photographs were displayed. Images of me in the back room of Clearwater Tailoring, surrounded by piles of alterations, standing before dawn at the ovens of Millie's Diner, mopping floors at various office buildings long after business hours had ended. "Mrs. Patterson never took a vacation," Ms. Rivera continued, "never bought herself new clothes, never complained. Her sole focus was providing for her son and maintaining the home her husband had loved." She produced another document, yellowed with age but perfectly preserved. "This is particularly illuminating, Your Honor. It's a letter from Westlake University, dated 1995, acknowledging receipt of Christopher Ross's final tuition payment, $12,421, along with a note thanking Mrs. Patterson for the homemade pies she provided weekly for the administrative staff's coffee breaks in lieu of the remaining $3,000 she couldn't afford." Whispers rippled through the courtroom. I caught glimpses of expressions around me: disbelief, admiration, and in some cases, recognition. Among the court staff, a few older employees nodded knowingly. They remembered the pies, the mending services, the little ways I'd bartered when cash ran short. Then came the moment I'd both dreaded and anticipated. "Finally, Your Honor," Ms. Rivera said, producing a small stack of photographs and property documents, "we present evidence regarding the financial relationship between Mrs. Patterson and the plaintiffs." She placed a deed on the evidence table. "This is the deed to 1842 Lakeside Drive, the property currently occupied by Christopher and Kimberly Ross. What's notable is that this property is not, as they've claimed in previous financial disclosures, owned by them. It is owned by Mrs. Patterson. The courtroom erupted with murmurs. Kimberly's face drained of color. Christopher looked physically ill. Mrs. Patterson's late husband purchased this property through a trust as an investment, Ms. Rivera explained. Upon his death, ownership transferred to Mrs. Patterson, who has leased it to her son and daughter-in-law at significantly below market rent for the past 7 years. Rent that has been faithfully deposited into an education fund for their daughter, Emily. Judge Sinclair examined the documents carefully. So the plaintiffs have been living in a home owned by the defendant, the very person they claim is financially incompetent, while benefiting from reduced rent that's been invested for their child's future? Exactly, Your Honor. Kimberly's lawyer rose hastily. Your Honor, my clients had no knowledge of this arrangement. Mr. Ross believed the property had been gifted to him by his father. I couldn't contain myself any longer. That is simply not true, I said firmly. Judge Sinclair nodded for me to continue. Christopher signed the lease agreement himself, I explained. He asked me not to tell Kimberly about the ownership arrangement because he wanted her to believe they could afford a more expensive home than they actually could. I agreed because I didn't want to embarrass my son. Christopher's face crumpled with shame as Kimberly turned to him, fury blazing in her eyes. Their whispered exchange grew increasingly heated until Judge Sinclair called for order. Mrs. Patterson, the judge said, his tone gentler than before. May I ask why you've kept these documents hidden until now? I met his gaze steadily. Because a mother should never have to defend herself against her child. Because I hoped Christopher would remember the values his father and I taught him without forcing me to humiliate him publicly. Because I believed that dignity sometimes means silence, until silence becomes surrender. The final document Ms. Rivera presented was the most difficult for me to share. A letter Richard had written to me shortly before his death, entrusting me with his modest investments and our home, expressing complete faith in my judgment and abilities. The letter ended with words that brought tears to my eyes even after all these years. Helen, your strength has always been in your quiet dignity. Never let anyone mistake your gentleness for weakness. By the time Ms. Rivera concluded, the atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed. Where there had been skepticism about an elderly woman's competence, there was now respect. Where there had been sympathy for a concerned son, there was now condemnation. Judge Sinclair removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose before addressing the courtroom. In my 30 years on the bench, he began slowly, I have seen many attempts to use the legal system as a tool for personal gain. I have seen families torn apart by greed disguised as concern, but rarely have I seen a case where the evidence so clearly contradicts the stated intentions of the plaintiffs. He looked directly at Christopher and Kimberly. The petition to declare Helen Patterson incompetent is denied. Furthermore, I am ordering a full financial audit of all transactions between the parties, with particular attention to the unauthorized transfer of funds from Mrs. Patterson's accounts. Kimberly's face contorted with rage. She gathered her designer purse and stormed toward the exit, not bothering to wait for her husband. Christopher remained seated, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Additionally, Judge Sinclair continued, I am implementing a protective order preventing any further attempts to interfere with Mrs. Patterson's assets for a period of 5 years. He paused, then added in a softer tone, Mrs. Patterson, this court owes you an apology for the distress this proceeding has caused. I hope you'll accept mine personally as well. Our eyes met, and I saw in his the memory of the young clerk I'd once helped, the exhausted law student I'd found weeping in an empty office, crushed by debt and doubt. I nodded slightly, acknowledging both his apology and the unspoken connection between us. As the judge adjourned the session, Sophia rushed forward to embrace me. You did it, she whispered fiercely. You showed them all. But my eyes were on my son, still seated at the plaintiff's table, alone now that his wife and lawyer had abandoned him. In his dejection, I saw glimpses of the little boy, who'd once skinned his knee and run to me for comfort. The teenager who'd worked alongside me in our garden, laughing as we planted tomatoes in the spring sunshine. The young man who'd hugged me tightly after his college graduation, whispering, This is all because of you, Mom. Where had that son gone? And was there any chance of finding him again? As the courtroom emptied, I gathered my courage and approached him. Christopher looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with shame. Mom, he began, his voice breaking. I don't know what to say. I sat beside him, my heart heavy with both sorrow and hope. Then don't say anything yet, I replied quietly. Just listen. The afternoon light slanted through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the now empty courtroom. Christopher sat beside me, his expensive suit rumpled, his carefully styled hair falling across his forehead like it used to when he was a boy coming in from playing football. "I never wanted any of this," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," I replied, though part of me wondered if that was true. "But you allowed it to happen." He nodded miserably. "Kim said, she convinced me that you were slipping, that we needed to step in before you hurt yourself or lost everything. She kept pointing out little things, a forgotten appointment, a misplaced key, the time you called her Jennifer by mistake. I called her Jennifer because that was the name on her credit card that I found in my mailbox," I said quietly. "The one she used to order those designer shoes last Christmas. I was trying to give her the benefit of the doubt." Christopher's head snapped up, confusion evident in his eyes. "What credit card?" I sighed. There were so many layers of deception between us now, so many breaches of trust on both sides. "That doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what happens next." "Is there a next for us?" he asked, vulnerability cracking his voice. "After everything that happened here today?" I studied my son's face, the face I'd memorized when he was just minutes old, the face I'd watched change from chubby-cheeked toddler to gangly teenager, to the handsome but troubled man before me now. Despite everything, he was still my child, the most precious gift Richard had left me. "That depends," I said carefully, "on what you want that next to look like." Before he could answer, the courtroom doors swung open, and Kimberly strode in, her face flushed with anger. "There you are," she snapped at Christopher. "I've been waiting in the car for 20 minutes. We need to go. Now." Her eyes flicked to me with undisguised hostility before returning to her husband. "Unless you're planning to beg Mommy to let us keep living in her house?" Christopher flinched as though she'd struck him. "Kim, please." "No, you please," she retorted, her voice rising. "Do you understand what happened here today? Your mother just humiliated us in front of the entire town. Everyone knows our business now. Everyone knows we don't even own our home. How am I supposed to show my face at the club again?" I remained silent, observing the dynamic between them with new clarity. This wasn't love. This wasn't partnership. This was ownership and control, the very thing they'd accused me of needing. "It didn't have to be this way," I said finally. "We could have talked about the house, about my finances, about your concerns for my well-being. As a family." Kimberly's laugh was brittle and cruel. "Family? You haven't been family since the day you refused to give us the money for our Aspen vacation. 5 years of working on Christopher and you still had him wrapped around your finger with your martyrdom act." "Kim, stop it," Christopher cut in, rising to his feet. "That's enough." "No, let her finish," I said calmly, though my heart raced at this confirmation of what I'd long suspected. Kimberly's systematic campaign to separate me from my son. "I want to hear what else I've done wrong." Kimberly's perfectly lined eyes narrowed. "You want to know? Fine. You've held him back his entire life, making him feel guilty for every opportunity, every advancement. Always the suffering widow, sacrificing everything while keeping score of every penny spent. It's pathetic." "Is that how you see me, Christopher?" I asked, turning to my son. He looked trapped between us, his eyes darting from his wife to me and back again. "No," he said finally. "No, that's not. I don't think that." "Well, you should," Kimberly snapped. "She's manipulating you right now, playing the victim when she's sitting on property worth a fortune. Property that should have been yours years ago." I stood slowly, gathering my purse and the now empty folder. "I think we've all said enough for today. Christopher, when you're ready to talk, really talk, you know where to find me." Kimberly stepped between us, her expensive perfume cloying in the close air. "He won't be calling. We're done here. And by the way, expect an appeal. My father knows people on the circuit court." I met her gaze steadily. "Do what you feel you must, Kimberly. But remember, every action leaves a mark on your soul, and some stains never wash out." As I walked away, I heard Christopher call my name, his voice uncertain and pained, but I didn't turn back. Some conversations needed space and time, and some required a kind of courage my son hadn't yet found. Outside, Sophia waited by her car, her face creased with concern. "Are you okay? I saw the Ice Queen go back in there." I smiled tiredly. "I'm better than, I've been in a long time, actually. There's a strange freedom in having everything exposed." "Where to now?" she asked as we pulled away from the courthouse. "Home," I replied simply. "I just want to go home." My house looked different somehow as we approached, more vibrantly mine than it had ever been. The white clapboard siding gleamed in the late afternoon sun, the purple clematis I'd nurtured. For decades, climbed faithfully up the trellis Richard had built. The porch swing where I'd rocked Christopher to sleep on countless summer nights creaked gently in the breeze. This was more than a property to be claimed or an asset to be divided. This was the physical manifestation of a life built through sacrifice and love. "Do you want me to stay?" Sophia asked as she helped me inside. "I don't think you should be alone tonight." I shook my head. "I need some quiet, but thank you for everything." After she left, I moved through the rooms slowly, touching familiar surfaces, reacquainting myself with corners and crevices that held decades of memories. In Christopher's old room, preserved like a museum exhibit to a childhood long past, I sat on the edge of the twin bed and allowed myself, finally, to cry. Not bitter tears of anger or betrayal, but cleansing tears of release. Tears for the son I'd raised and somehow lost. Tears for the years of silence when I should have spoken. Tears for Richard, who hadn't lived to see what had become of the family he'd cherished. The ringing of the telephone startled me from my reflections. I considered letting it go to voicemail but found myself reaching for the receiver anyway. "Hello? Mrs. Patterson." Judge Sinclair's voice was instantly recognizable. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Your Honor," I replied, surprised by the personal call. "Edward, please." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'm not calling in my official capacity. I just wanted to check that you got home safely." "I did, thank you." A pause stretched between us, filled with unspoken memories and connections. "I never knew it was you," he said finally. "All those years ago when I was ready to quit law school. The pies for my landlord, the textbooks that mysteriously appeared on my desk, the anonymous loan that paid my final semester's tuition. I never knew who my guardian angel was." I smiled, remembering the eager young man with perpetually ink-stained fingers who'd reminded me so much of Richard. "You weren't meant to know. Helping was its own reward. How did you recognize me today? It's been nearly 40 years and I certainly don't look the same." "Your voice," I replied, "and the way you tap your fingers when you're thinking, left to right like playing piano keys. Some patterns never change." Another pause, more comfortable, this time. "Mrs. Patterson, Helen, what you did for me changed the course of my life. I've tried to pay it forward all these years, helping young law students who struggle like I did, but I never got to thank the person who made it all possible. You're thanking me now," I said softly, "and seeing you on that bench today, serving justice with compassion, that's all the thanks I ever needed." We spoke for a few minutes more, cautious, respectful conversation between two people connected by long-ago kindnesses, rather than recent legal proceedings. When we said goodbye, I felt a quiet contentment settle over me. Some good, at least, had come from this difficult day. As evening descended, I made myself a simple dinner and ate on the back porch, watching fireflies blink in the gathering. Darkness. The house felt emptier than usual, the silence heavier. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider what it might mean to live truly alone, without even the distant hope of reconciliation with my son. Could I rebuild my life at 78? Find purpose beyond the identity of Christopher's mother or Richard's widow? Create meaning in the final chapter of a life that had been defined largely by service to others? The questions swirled in my mind as I prepared for bed, following the familiar routines that had structured my days for decades. As I passed the hall telephone, I noticed the answering machine blinking. 3 messages. The first was from Ms. Rivera, confirming our appointment the following week to discuss financial restructuring options, a delicate way of addressing the need to remove Christopher from my accounts. The second was from Sophia, checking in one more time before bed. The third made my heart stutter. Christopher's voice, hollow and hesitant. "Mom, I don't know if you're there or if you even want to hear from me, but I need to tell you, I'm sorry for everything. I don't expect forgiveness. I need you to know that I see what happened, what I allowed to happen, and I'm ashamed. I'll call again tomorrow, if that's okay." A long pause, filled with the sound of his breathing. "I love you, Mom." I never stopped. I just forgot what that meant for a while. I sat in the darkness, the machine's red light blinking steadily like a distant lighthouse. Perhaps there was hope after all. Not for an immediate return to what we'd been, but for something new to grow from the wreckage of what we'd lost. Morning arrived with soft raindrops tapping against my bedroom window, a gentle percussion accompanying my first moments of consciousness. I lay still, allowing the events of yesterday to wash over me. The courtroom confrontation, the revealed truths, Christopher's late-night message. So much had changed in 24 hours. The silent war that had been waged in whispers and glances for years had finally erupted into open conflict, leaving everything altered in its wake. The question now was what would rise from the ashes. I made my coffee stronger than usual, needing the fortification for whatever the day might bring. As I sipped the dark brew on my covered porch, watching rain transform my garden into a glistening wonderland, my phone chimed with a text from Sophia. Channel 7 news van outside your house. Don't answer the door or phone, coming over. I frowned, peering through the curtains toward the street. Sure enough, a white van with a satellite dish perched on top idled near my mailbox. A young woman in a rain slicker stood beside it, speaking into her phone while gesturing toward my home. This unexpected development sent a wave of anxiety through me. The courtroom drama had been difficult enough in the relative privacy of legal proceedings. The thought of my family's painful struggle becoming public spectacle was unbearable. True to her word, Sophia arrived within 15 minutes, slipping through my back door with determined efficiency. At 69, my friend moved with the energy of someone decades younger, her silver hair cut in a stylish bob that framed a face lined by both laughter and sorrow. Vultures, she muttered, peering through the kitchen blinds. Someone at the courthouse must have tipped them off about the judge's connection to you. They're calling it the case of the invisible benefactor online. Online? I echoed weakly. Sophia grimaced, pulling out her phone. It's all over the Clearwater community forums. Wealthy widow exposes ungrateful son and gold-digging wife in dramatic courtroom showdown. Local judge reveals secret guardian angel who saved his career. The comments section is colorful. I sank into a kitchen chair, my hands trembling slightly. This is exactly what I didn't want. More humiliation for Christopher. More scandal. Helen. Sophia's tone was gentle but firm as she sat across from me. You didn't create this situation. You only defended yourself when pushed to the absolute limit. Before I could respond, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. That's the third call this morning, I admitted. I haven't answered any of them. Good, Sophia nodded approvingly. Let's keep it that way. This will blow over in a few days when some celebrity does something scandalous or the mayor's embezzlement trial starts. As we sat discussing strategies for avoiding unwanted attention, another text arrived. This one from Christopher. Mom, are you watching the news? I'm so sorry about this circus. Can I come over? Need to talk. My heart leapt at the prospect of reconciliation. But caution tempered my hope. Christopher wants to come over, I told Sophia. What do you think? Is he genuinely remorseful? Or is this damage control because of the media attention? Sophia considered carefully. Hard to say, but you'll never know his true intentions if you don't see him. I texted back. There are reporters outside. Not a good time. His response came immediately. I know a way to avoid them. Back entrance through Mrs. Jenkins' yard at 2 p.m. Mrs. Jenkins, my elderly neighbor whose property backed up to mine, connected by a small gate hidden among overgrown hydrangeas. Christopher remembered the secret path we'd used years ago when he was a teenager sneaking in past curfew. Tell him yes, Sophia advised after I showed her the message. But I'm staying right here with you. I shook my head. No, this is something I need to do alone. Some conversations can only happen in private. Sophia left reluctantly around noon, making me promise to call her immediately after Christopher's visit. The hours until his arrival stretched endlessly, filled with nervous anticipation. I busied myself baking, an apple pie with cinnamon and nutmeg, Christopher's favorite since childhood. The familiar routine of measuring, mixing, and rolling dough steadied my hands and calmed my mind. At precisely 2 o'clock, a soft knock came at my back door. Christopher stood on the steps, soaked from the rain that had intensified throughout the day. Without the expensive suit and styled hair, he looked younger, more vulnerable, more like the son I remembered. You remembered the path, I said, stepping aside to let him in. I remember everything, Mom, he replied softly, even the things I pretended to forget. He noticed the pie cooling on the counter, and a complex emotion crossed his face. Recognition, nostalgia, regret. You baked. I always bake when I'm nervous, I admitted. Some habits never change. An awkward silence settled between us as he stood dripping on the kitchen floor. I handed him a towel, the domestic gesture so familiar it made my throat tighten. Kimberly left, he said abruptly, rubbing the towel over his hair. Packed 3 suitcases and went to her sister's in Tampa. Said she couldn't handle the public humiliation of living in a borrowed house with a mama's boy. I absorbed this information carefully, unsure how to respond. Was I supposed to offer sympathy? Relief? I'm sorry, I said finally, the words inadequate but sincere. Christopher shook his head. Don't be. It's been coming for a long time. Yesterday just accelerated things. He moved to the kitchen table, the same oak table where he'd done homework, where we'd shared thousands of meals, where I'd sat alone after he moved out, setting a single place instead of two. The reporters, he began hesitantly. They've been calling me, too, offering money for my side of the story. One of them even showed up at my office. Whatever happens, I said firmly, we'll handle it together. That's what family does. Are we still that? He asked, his voice cracking. Family? After everything I did? I sat across from him, studying the face that was simultaneously so familiar and so strange to me now. We'll always be family, Christopher. But trust, that's something we'll need to rebuild. He nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I don't deserve a second chance. No, I agreed, my tone gentle but honest. You don't. But I'm giving you one anyway. Not because you've earned it, but because that's what love does. It offers grace even when it's undeserved. His composure broke then, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I moved around the table and did what mothers have done since time began. I held my child while he cried. His tears soaked through my cardigan, but I didn't move, didn't speak, just provided the anchor he needed in the storm of consequences he'd created. When he finally quieted, I poured coffee for us both and cut 2 slices of warm pie. The familiar ritual seemed to ease some of the tension between us. I keep thinking about Dad, Christopher said, pushing the pie around his plate. What he would say if he could see what happened yesterday. I considered this, remembering Richard's steady moral compass, his belief in second chances, his fierce protection of family bonds. Your father believed that character isn't defined by never making mistakes, but by how you respond when you realize you've made them. Christopher nodded slowly. I've made so many, Mom. Not just yesterday, but for years. I let Kimberly convince me that you were holding me back, that I deserved more than you were willing to give, that the house was rightfully mine since I was an only child. When did it start? I asked, needing to understand the evolution of his betrayal. When did things change between us? He sighed deeply. Remember when I lost the promotion at Westbrook Financial 5 years ago? The one that went to Martin Green instead? I nodded. Martin had been a frequent dinner guest in our home, a friend Christopher had known since college. Kimberly was furious, said I was too soft, too ethical, that Martin knew how to play the game better. He stared into his coffee. She started pointing out how your values, our family values, were keeping me from success. How your emphasis on honesty and modest living was outdated in today's world. And you believed her, I said, not as an accusation, but as a sad recognition. Not at first, he admitted, but she's persuasive. And I was vulnerable, embarrassed about the promotion, worried about providing the lifestyle she expected. When she suggested we should own your house, that it was wasteful for one elderly woman to have all that space, it started to make a twisted kind of sense. I took a slow breath, processing the calculated nature of what I'd suspected, but never fully comprehended. The cognitive assessment with Dr. Collins, I asked quietly. Was that her idea too? Christopher's silence was answer enough. I need to know something, I said finally. The day you came to fix my porch light and you found the box of your father's old papers in the attic, did you know the property deed for your house was in there? He met my eyes directly for the first time. Yes, he whispered. I saw it. I should have told Kimberly then, but I was ashamed and afraid she'd leave if she knew we didn't own the house. So I kept pretending. The lie got bigger every month until I couldn't see a way out except to have me declared incompetent. I finished for him. So you could take legal control of everything. I'm so sorry, Mom, he said, the words woefully inadequate for the magnitude of his betrayal. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I reached across the table and took his hand. The hand I'd once held as we crossed streets. The hand I'd bandaged after countless childhood mishaps. The hand that had signed papers attempting to strip me of my dignity. Forgiveness isn't something you earn, Christopher. It's something you're given. But rebuilding trust, that's a different matter entirely. That will take time. And consistent actions, not just words. We talked for hours as the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows. Not just about the court case or Kimberly's manipulation, but about deeper wounds that had festered between us for years, about expectations and disappointments, about the ways we'd both failed to truly see each other. As evening approached, the reality of his situation became clear. Christopher had nowhere to go. The house he'd shared with Kimberly was technically mine, but she remained there, surrounded by the trappings of a life built on illusions. His marriage was crumbling. His reputation at work was compromised by the public scandal. His financial situation was precarious at best. "You can stay in your old room tonight," I offered, "until we figure out something more permanent." The relief in his eyes was palpable. "Are you sure?" I nodded. Family is family, even when it's complicated. As I prepared the twin bed with fresh sheets, tucking hospital corners just as I had when he was a child, I realized that forgiveness wasn't a single moment, but a process we would navigate together, step by careful step. That night, as I lay awake listening to the familiar creaks of my son moving in the room across the hall, I thought about the long road ahead of us. Rebuilding trust would not be easy or quick. The damage done could not be erased with a single conversation or a night of tears. But we had made a beginning. And sometimes beginnings are enough. 3 months passed. Each day a careful step in the delicate dance of reconciliation. Christopher remained in his childhood bedroom far longer than either of us had anticipated, the arrangement evolving from temporary solution to healing necessity. In those close quarters, we couldn't avoid the difficult conversations that needed to happen, conversations we might have sidestepped with the buffer of physical distance. Kimberly filed for divorce 6 weeks after the courtroom showdown. The papers arrived, on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who seemed uncomfortable with his task. Christopher accepted them with quiet resignation, as though he'd been expecting this final severance. "Are you okay?" I asked that evening, finding him sitting on the back porch, staring at the garden where fireflies danced in the summer twilight. "I'm not sure," he answered honestly. "Part of me feels relief. Another part feels like I've failed at the most important commitment of my life." I sat beside him, our rocking chairs moving in gentle synchronicity. "Marriage is sacred," I said carefully, "but not when it's built on manipulation and control. What Kimberly wanted wasn't partnership. It was possession." Christopher nodded slowly. "I see that now. I think I always saw it somewhere deep down, but I didn't want to admit it. The end of something false makes room for something true," I offered. "Your father used to say that." A small smile crossed his face. "I remember. He said it when his business partner embezzled from their company. Better to lose a dishonest partner than keep compromising your integrity, son." We rocked in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythmic creaking of the chairs blending with the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. "I got a call from Judge Sinclair today," I said finally. "He's organizing a scholarship for first-generation law students at Clearwater Community College. Asked if I'd consider being on the selection committee." Christopher turned to me, surprise evident in his expression. "That's wonderful, Mom. What did you tell him?" I said yes. The decision had been surprisingly easy. It feels right to help young people who are working hard against difficult odds, to be visible in that role instead of anonymous. "You've spent most of your life helping others without recognition," Christopher observed. "Maybe it's time people knew about the difference you've made." His words touched something deep within me, an acknowledgement of the invisible labor that had defined my existence, the countless hours of work that had gone unnoticed, the sacrifices that had been taken for granted, the strength that had been mistaken for submission. "Maybe it is," I agreed softly. The media interest in our story had faded as quickly as Sophia had predicted, but something unexpected had emerged in its place. Women began approaching me at the grocery store, after church services, in the library where I volunteered. Older women who saw in my courtroom stand something that resonated with their own experiences. "You spoke for all of us," Mrs. Hendricks told me tearfully one Sunday after services. "All of us who've been dismissed because we've grown old, who've had our competence questioned because our hair turned gray." These conversations led to weekly coffee gatherings in my living room, informal at first, just 3 or 4 women sharing stories over homemade scones and strong coffee. But the circle grew steadily until my modest living room could barely contain them. Women in their 60s, 70s, 80s, even a spirited 93-year-old who arrived with her oxygen tank and irreverent humor intact. We called ourselves the Invisibles, embracing with ironic pride the very quality that had once diminished us. We shared not just stories but practical knowledge, information about elder law, financial protection, health advocacy. Sophia, with her background in social work, became our unofficial legal resource, explaining complicated statutes in accessible language. Christopher observed these gatherings with quiet fascination, often making himself scarce during the meetings, but ensuring the coffee pot stayed full and fresh cookies appeared on plates. One evening, after the last visitor had departed, he helped me wash the accumulated teacups and coffee mugs. "You've created something important here," he said, carefully drying a delicate porcelain cup that had been my mother's. "These women, they leave standing taller than when they arrived." "We strengthen each other," I replied, touched by his observation. "There's power in shared experience." He nodded thoughtfully, then hesitated before continuing. "I've been thinking about something, a way I might be able to help." "Oh, I have a background in finance," he said, placing the dried cup carefully on the shelf. "What if I offered a workshop for your group? Something about financial protection for older women? How to recognize and avoid exploitation, secure accounts, understand investments?" The suggestion surprised me, not just for its practicality, but for what it represented. Christopher's desire to make amends in a meaningful way, using his professional skills to protect women like me. "That would be wonderful," I said, my voice catching slightly. "They would appreciate that tremendously." The first workshop took place 2 weeks later. Christopher stood nervously before 15 elderly women, armed with handouts and a carefully prepared presentation. His corporate polish had softened over the months away from that environment, replaced by something more authentic and approachable. "Financial exploitation of seniors has become a silent epidemic," he began, his voice strengthening as he continued. "But knowledge is protection. Today we'll discuss specific steps you can take to secure your assets and recognize warning signs, including some tactics I'm ashamed to admit I once considered using myself." That last admission silenced the room, the courage it took to acknowledge his past. Wrongdoing, especially to a group of women who resembled his own mother, was not lost on anyone present. I felt my heart swell with a complicated mixture of pride and sorrow. The workshop was a tremendous success, generating questions that kept Christopher engaged well past the planned ending time. Women who had initially regarded him with suspicion, knowing fragments of our story from courthouse gossip, gradually warmed to his genuine desire to help. "Your son has a gift for teaching," Mrs. Campbell, a retired school principal, commented as she prepared to leave. "He explains complicated concepts without condescension. That's rare in financial advisors." The workshop became a monthly occurrence, expanding to include topics like recognizing online scams and understanding Medicare benefits. Christopher threw himself into the research, preparing materials that were increasingly comprehensive and accessible. One evening in late September, as we sat reviewing feedback forms from the latest session, Christopher broached a subject we'd been delicately avoiding. "I've been looking at apartments," he said casually, though I detected underlying tension in his voice. "There's a nice place over on Maple Street, near the library." I set down my reading glasses, carefully controlling my expression. This moment had been inevitable, necessary even, but I found myself unexpectedly reluctant to face it. "That would be convenient for your volunteer work," I observed, referring to the financial counseling he'd begun offering at the community center. "Yes," he agreed, "but I wanted to make sure you'd be okay with me moving out. I don't want you to think I'm abandoning you again." The careful phrasing revealed the depth of his concern, not just about leaving, but about what that departure might symbolize after all we'd been through. "Christopher," I said gently, "you're a grown man. You need your own space, your own life. That's not abandonment. It's normal and healthy." He nodded, but uncertainty lingered in his expression. "I thought maybe we could have Sunday dinners together, and I'd still come over for the workshops." "I'd like that very much," I replied, relief washing through me. This wasn't an ending but a transition, a healthier relationship built on mutual respect, rather than obligation or dependence. As October arrived, bringing crisp air and trees ablaze with autumn colors, Christopher moved into his apartment. The house felt emptier without him, but also somehow lighter, freed from the weight of unresolved tensions that had lingered even as we'd worked toward healing. I channeled my energy into expanding what had become known around Clearwater as the Invisibles Initiative. With Judge Sinclair's support, we secured a small grant to produce educational materials about elder rights and protections. Sophia's connections at the senior center provided us with space for larger gatherings. Christopher's financial workshops continued to draw participants from beyond our original group. What had begun as a personal defense against exploitation was evolving into something broader, a community resource built on the principle that aging should bring dignity, rather than diminishment. One crisp autumn morning, as I prepared materials for our upcoming meeting, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Kimberly standing on my porch, her designer clothes and perfect makeup at odds with the uncertainty in her expression. "May I come in?" she asked, her customary confidence notably absent. I hesitated, memories of her cruelty still fresh despite the intervening months. But something in her demeanor, a vulnerability I'd never witnessed before, made me step aside. "Of course," I said, leading her to the living room. She sat perched on the edge of the sofa, her handbag clutched tightly in manicured fingers. For several moments, she seemed unable to speak. "Would you like some coffee?" I offered, more to break the uncomfortable silence than from genuine hospitality. "No, thank you," she replied. Another pause. "I won't take much of your time. I just needed to say something in person." I waited, giving her the space to find her words. "I was wrong," she said finally, the admission clearly costing her considerable effort. "About you. About many things. The divorce has given me time to reflect, and I owe you an apology. Of all the scenarios I might have imagined for this day, Kimberly's apology hadn't featured among them. I studied her face, searching for signs of the manipulation that had characterized our previous interactions, but found only what appeared to be genuine remorse. "What brought this on?" I asked carefully. She glanced down at her hands. "My mother fell last month, broke her hip. She's been living with me during her recovery, and it's been challenging." I nodded, beginning to understand. "Caregiving often reveals our true character." "Yes," she agreed softly. "I'm not proud of what I've discovered about mine. The impatience, the resentment, even towards someone I genuinely love." She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "It's made me see what I did to you in a different light. Thank you for telling me this," I said, finding forgiveness easier than I might have expected. "Recognizing our failures is the first step toward changing them." "You sound like Christopher," she said with a faint smile. "He always had that capacity for forgiveness. I didn't appreciate it when we were together. I saw it as weakness. And now," I prompted gently, "now I understand it's actually strength," she admitted, "the kind I'm trying to develop." We talked for nearly an hour, not as adversaries or even as former family members, but as two women at different stages of understanding what it means to care for others without losing yourself in the process. When she left, something rigid within me had softened. Not enough to forget the pain she'd caused, but enough to hope that her newfound insight might be genuine. That evening, I called Christopher to tell him about Kimberly's visit. "Are you okay?" he asked immediately, concern evident in his voice. "I'm fine," I assured him. "Better than fine, actually. There's something healing about witnessing someone else's growth, even someone who once hurt you deeply." "That's very generous of you, Mom." "Not generous," I corrected gently. "Just human. We're all works in progress, trying to become better versions of ourselves. Some just start the journey later than others." As we ended the call, I stood at my kitchen window, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. At 78, I had discovered a new chapter opening before me. Not the quiet withdrawal from life that Kimberly and Christopher had once prescribed, but an engaged purpose built on the very experiences they had tried to discount. The irony wasn't lost on me. Their attempt to diminish me had instead revealed a strength I might never have recognized had it not been challenged. A strength now benefiting others who, like me, had been rendered invisible by age but refused to disappear. The winter holidays approached with a gentleness I hadn't experienced in years. Freed from the tension that had characterized recent family gatherings, I found myself actually looking forward to Christmas rather than dreading it. Christopher and I established new traditions that honored our healing relationship. Every Sunday evening, he would come for dinner, often bringing ingredients to cook alongside me, a shared activity that allowed for a comfortable conversation as we chopped vegetables or kneaded dough together. "I've been thinking about Thanksgiving," he said during one such evening in early November, carefully dicing onions for the stew we were preparing. "Would you mind if I invited a few people to join us? Sophia, of course, and maybe Judge Sinclair if he doesn't have other plans." "That sounds lovely," I agreed, surprised and touched by his initiative. Previous holidays had always been orchestrated by Kimberly, with Christopher and I playing assigned roles in her perfect family tableau. Anyone else you're thinking of? He hesitated, wiping his hands on a dish towel. Actually, I was wondering if we might invite Emily. Emily, his stepdaughter from Kimberly's first marriage, a quiet 16-year-old I'd rarely been allowed to know. Kimberly had carefully controlled those interactions, limiting them to formal occasions where meaningful connection was nearly impossible. Of course, I said immediately. I'd love to have Emily here, but would Kimberly allow it? The divorce agreement gives me visitation rights, Christopher explained, and Emily's been reaching out more since we separated. I think she misses having me around. You were more of a father to her than her biological dad ever was, I observed. Christopher had always spoken fondly of Emily, defending her against Kimberly's often harsh criticism of the girl's academic performance and introverted nature. I'm trying to maintain that relationship, he admitted. It's not easy with Kimberly in the middle, but Emily's old enough now to make some decisions for herself. Thanksgiving arrived with perfect autumn crispness. Cold enough for a fire in the hearth, but sunny enough to illuminate the remaining red and gold leaves clinging to the maple tree in my backyard. The dining room table, expanded with all its leaves, gleamed with polish and the glow of candles. Judge Sinclair, Edward, as he'd insisted I call him outside of professional settings, arrived first, bearing an excellent bottle of wine and a shyness that reminded me of his younger self. Sophia came next, bringing her famous pecan pie and a vibrant energy that immediately put everyone at ease. When Christopher's car pulled into the driveway, I peered anxiously through the window, uncertain whether Emily would actually be with him. The passenger door opened, and a tall, slender girl emerged, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her posture suggesting a wariness that broke my heart. Emily, I greeted her warmly at the door. I'm so happy you could come. She offered a tentative smile. Thanks for having me, Mrs. Patterson. Helen, please, I corrected gently. We're family. Something in those simple words seemed to reach her, the wariness in her eye. Posture eased slightly as she handed me a small, carefully wrapped package. I made this in art class, she explained, a hint of color rising in her cheeks. Mom said it was silly, but I thought you might like it. Inside the wrapping was a hand-thrown ceramic bowl, glazed in blues and greens that swirled together like ocean waves. Despite some minor imperfections, it held a beauty born of genuine effort and creativity. It's absolutely beautiful, I said sincerely, turning it to admire how the light played across the glaze. I'll treasure it. Emily's smile grew more confident. I remembered you had blue curtains in your kitchen. Christopher told me they were your favorite color. The fact that they'd discussed me, that Christopher had shared such details with her, warmed me deeply. You have an excellent memory and a wonderful artistic talent. Throughout the meal, I watched Emily gradually relax, especially in conversation with Sophia, who had a gift for drawing out shy people. By dessert, she was actively participating in the discussion about the latest books they'd both read, her intelligence and sensitivity evident in her thoughtful observations. She reminds me of you, Christopher commented quietly as we cleared plates together in the kitchen. That same perceptiveness, the way she notices details others miss. She's a special young woman, I agreed. I hope we'll see more of her. He nodded, his expression both hopeful and determined. I'm working on it. The custody agreement is complicated, but now that she's 16, her preferences carry more weight. As winter settled over Clearwater, Emily became a regular presence in my home, initially just during Christopher's designated weekends, but increasingly on her own initiative. She'd stop by after school, ostensibly to help with projects for the Invisibles, but I suspected she also craved the peaceful atmosphere our home provided, compared to the perfection-driven environment Kimberly maintained. I taught her to bake my signature apple pie. She showed me how to use Instagram to share information about our elder advocacy programs. We discovered a mutual love of British mystery novels and began our own informal book club, discussing plots and characters over cups of tea and homemade scones. You're good for her, Christopher observed one evening after driving Emily home. She's opening up in ways I've never seen before, even doing better in school. We understand each other, I said simply. Sometimes people just need a safe place to be themselves without judgment. December brought a heavy snowfall that transformed Clearwater into a winter wonderland. The Invisibles holiday party, held at the community center, drew over 50 participants, not just our regular members, but their friends and family members curious about the organization that had given new purpose to the elders in their lives. Christopher's financial workshop series had expanded to include younger women learning how to secure their future independence. Sophia's social work background helped us develop an elder abuse prevention program that had caught the attention of county officials. Judge Sinclair provided legal insights and connections that legitimized our grassroots efforts. What had begun as my personal defense against exploitation had evolved into a community resource that bridged generations rather than dividing them. On Christmas Eve, as we prepared for the intimate dinner that would include Christopher, Emily, Sophia, and Edward, whose tentative courtship of Sophia had become the subject of gentle teasing among our group, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary year behind me. 12 months earlier, I had been a woman slowly being erased by my son's betrayal, by my daughter-in-law's manipulation, by society's casual dismissal of aging women. I had been fighting a silent battle against invisibility, one I wasn't sure I could win. Now I stood in my kitchen, preparing a feast for people who truly saw me, not just as Christopher's mother or Richard's widow, but as Helen Patterson, a woman with value, purpose, and wisdom earned through decades of quiet strength. The doorbell rang, interrupting my reflections. I opened it to find Emily on the porch, her cheeks flushed from the cold, snowflakes melting in her dark hair. "I came early to help," she announced, unwrapping her scarf. "Dad texted that he'll be here in an hour. He's picking up Judge Sinclair and Sophia." "Perfect timing," I said, helping her with her coat. I was just about to start the pie crust. In the kitchen, as I demonstrated the proper technique for cutting butter into flour, Emily asked the question that had clearly been on her mind for some time. "Grandma Helen," she began, hesitantly, the title she'd recently started using that filled me with quiet joy. "Why did you forgive my mom and dad after what they did to you?" I don't think I could have. I considered her question carefully, aware of its importance to her developing sense of justice and morality. "Forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened," I explained, guiding her hands as she worked the dough. "It's about refusing to let bitterness consume you. Your father earned his forgiveness by acknowledging his mistakes and working to repair the damage. With your mother, it's more complicated, but I've chosen to release the anger for my own peace, not because she deserved it." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "Mom's different since the divorce, still strict but less mean. She actually apologized to me last week when she criticized my art project. That's never happened before. People can change when they're forced to see themselves clearly," I observed. "Sometimes painful experiences are the only way that happens." "Like in court," Emily said quietly. "Dad told me everything. About how they tried to take your house, how they lied about you being confused, how the judge recognized you because you'd helped him years ago. I hadn't realized Christopher had shared such details with her, but I was glad for his honesty. That day was difficult for everyone, I acknowledged, but necessary, I think. You didn't try to get revenge," she noted, her eyes studying my face. "You could have made Dad pay back the money he took. You could have kicked them out of the house they were living in, but you didn't. Revenge only continues the cycle of hurt," I replied, wiping flour from my hands. "Breaking that cycle requires someone to choose a different path. Besides, the most powerful response to cruelty isn't more cruelty, it's dignity. It's standing in your truth without stooping to methods that compromise who you are." She considered this, her young face serious with contemplation. "I think that's the bravest thing, not fighting back when you could, but choosing not to." "It takes practice," I admitted with a smile. "I'm still learning myself." When Christopher arrived with Sophia and Edward, the house filled with comfortable chatter and laughter. We gathered around the tree to exchange gifts before dinner. Nothing extravagant, just thoughtful tokens that reflected our growing understanding of one another. Edward gave me a first edition of Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility that he'd found at an estate sale, remembering my mention of Austen as my favorite author. Sophia contributed a beautiful hand-knitted shawl in my favorite shade of blue. Christopher presented me with a digital photo frame already loaded with restored images from our family history. Richard and me, on our wedding day, Christopher's childhood milestones, beloved moments I'd feared were lost when old photographs began to fade. Emily's gift was the most surprising, a small canvas on which she'd painted a portrait of me. Not as I appeared now, but as the young woman I'd been in my 30s, based on an old photograph Christopher had shared. She'd captured not just my appearance, but something of my essence, the determination in my eyes, the slight tilt of my chin that suggested quiet resilience. "It's called The Invisible Years," she explained shyly, "because that's when you were doing all the important work that nobody saw." Tears filled my eyes as I embraced her. "It's perfect," I whispered. "Absolutely perfect." After dinner, as we gathered in the living room with dessert plates balanced on our laps, Edward cleared his throat nervously. "I have an announcement," he said, glancing at Sophia for encouragement. "The county commissioners have approved funding for an elder justice center to open next year, and they've asked if the Invisibles would partner with them as community liaisons." The news was met with exclamations of surprise and delight. Such official recognition legitimized everything we'd been building over the past year. "There's more," Edward continued. "They specifically requested that Helen serve as the program director, with compensation, of course. They were quite impressed with the educational materials and workshop curriculum you've developed." I sat in stunned silence, processing this unexpected development. A paid position, official recognition, the opportunity to expand our work beyond Clearwater. "You don't have to decide immediately," Edward added gently, "but they're quite serious about wanting you at the helm." "You should do it, Mom," Christopher encouraged. "No one understands the issues better than you do." "Absolutely," Sophia agreed. "You've already been doing the work. This just gives you the resources to reach more people." I looked around at the faces of those gathered in my living room, my son who had found his way back to integrity, his stepdaughter blossoming in an atmosphere of genuine acceptance, my friend whose loyalty had never wavered, the judge whose career I'd once saved without expecting recognition. "I think," I said slowly, "this is exactly what I'm meant to do next." As the evening wound down and good nights were exchanged, I found myself alone with Christopher for a few minutes. We stood on the porch, watching snow drift lazily through the glow of street lamps. "I never imagined this time last year," he said quietly, "that we'd end up here. I thought I'd lost you forever." "We lost each other for a while," I corrected gently, "but found something better on the other side." He nodded, contemplating the transformed landscape of our relationship. "Dad would be proud of you, of everything you've built from what could have destroyed you." "He'd be proud of you too," I replied, "for finding your way back, for becoming the man he always believed you could be." Christopher's eyes glistened in the porch light. "I keep thinking about what you said in court that day, about dignity, sometimes meaning silence, until silence becomes surrender." He turned to face me fully. "I'm glad you finally spoke, Mom, not just for yourself, but for all the women who didn't have your courage." As he hugged me goodbye, I felt the full circle of our journey, from the infant I'd once cradled in my arms to the man who now embraced me with genuine respect. We had weathered betrayal and forgiveness, hurt, and healing. We had dismantled the walls between us brick by painful brick, rebuilding something stronger in their place. Later that night, after everyone had gone and the house settled into peaceful quiet, I stood before the living room window watching snowflakes swirl in the gentle winter wind. The reflection of the Christmas tree lights danced across the glass, mingling with my own image, a woman no longer invisible, no longer silent when silence served only to enable injustice. I thought of all the women who had shared their stories in my living room over the past year, women who had been dismissed, deceived, diminished, women who were finding their voices and their power, often for the first time, women who now saw in my story the possibility of their own liberation, from the shadows of neglect or exploitation. I thought of Emily, poised at the beginning of womanhood, learning lessons about dignity and self-worth that would shape her approach to life's inevitable challenges. I thought of how the cycle of dismissal that had nearly claimed me had been broken before it could touch her. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each unique crystal adding to the blanket, transforming the landscape. Like those snowflakes, the individual stories shared through the Invisibles had accumulated into something larger, a movement that was gradually changing how our community viewed and valued its elder members. The courtroom confrontation that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning. My folder of hidden documents, preserved through decades of silence, had unlocked not just my own voice, but the voices of countless others. I moved to my desk and opened the leather folder, empty now of its original contents, but recently repurposed to hold notes for the Elder Justice Center. On the inside cover, I had taped Richard's final words to me. "Helen, your strength has always been in your quiet dignity. Never let anyone mistake your gentleness for weakness." He had been right about the dignity, but perhaps not about the quiet. Sometimes strength required speaking truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable. Sometimes love meant standing firm rather than stepping aside. Sometimes the most powerful legacy wasn't what you accumulated, but what you defended. Your self-respect, your autonomy, your right to be seen. As I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the bedroom mirror. Silver hair, lines of experience etched around my eyes and mouth, shoulders straight with hard-won confidence. I was no longer the invisible woman who cleaned offices after hours or sewed other people's clothes until her fingers bled. I was Helen Patterson, seen at last in the fullness of who I had always been. They had thought I was just an old woman, but the truth was, I was the foundation their lives were built on, and no one could erase that. And that, in the end, was dignity enough.